Anyway, I'm going to start by thanking all the presenters for their extremely provocative presentations. I do want to not take up too much airtime and leave enough room for the audience to be able to dialogue at length with our presenters, including, I hope, Vastavika Bhagat, who is now on the screen. So with that, hi, welcome. So what I thought, I was stunned. I come from an extremely logocentric and logos biased discipline into this debate, and what Nayanika Mathur presented, a lot of it is actually about, debates about the, what was it? I'm trying to remember Assan's very nice phrase, utility and futility of the Anthropocene and various, but what strikes me in this panel is the amazing ways in which you both point out the gaps and the incompleteness and give us certain templates to close those gaps through turning away from the logocentric into figures modeling of various kinds of, from the geometric abstractions of the spiral and the daira to Vastavika, your use of architectural visual tools in order to present and your entire presentation, like this is a kind of an experiential and affective use of form that I very much appreciate coming from a purely literary discipline. So I, and similarly, Nayanika, your presentation reminded me actually of Chernobyl and the post-human utopianism of big mammals, the return of charismatic big mammals, and how that could also be extracted, as Assan reminded us. Maybe Chernobyl was a while ago, but it was the post-human utopia, right? And this is how I remember David Attenborough in one of his Planet Earth series. It's like, okay, this is what the world could be if only we could go away. And so we are past those phases, thank goodness, but by far not there yet. And so I have myself run into Iftikhar, you might remember in 2016, we tried to bring in Latin American community organizers, Gladys Zulzul, and the problem of translation. I bring up figures versus logos, etc. Because also, it is very, very difficult to create the kinds of dialogues that we are talking about, simply because, not just because of the space, but because of the dominant language. And our experience was that you need translators in order to actually include, particular actors in these dialogues, and vice versa. So how, again, going back to the logos, my question would be, how do you all envision creating languages? I say languages because not one language as a perfect translating medium, but actually mediums of languages in the plural. So that would be my question as discussant, and I invite the audience to weigh in.
Maybe the presenters can also.
Yeah, I was going to, sorry. Would you like to come up here, and that way you will interlocute both backwards and forwards. And my question can be postponed to the end. I see a lot of hands in the audience, so please go ahead. Shall we start from the front here?
Sure. I'll give you the
Is there a mic?
Maybe take a few questions together.
Sure.
Thanks so much. These were really fantastic papers. I was really excited to hear them. Nanika, I had a question for you. Sorry to engage in a little bit of disciplinary banter, but you began with sort of thinking about anthropology's role in the Anthropocene and how can we kind of reshape this concept in a way that's useful and think about anthropological method. And what I heard in your paper, which was terrific, and I loved Crooked Cats, was a kind of raising up of stories that other people have perhaps dismissed as a form of knowledge, and particularly Amitav Ghosh and others who are looking for politics in a specific kind of way, and you're sort of saying, well, it's there, it's just being expressed differently. And I actually thought that was sort of like actually a sort of wonderfully traditional role for anthropology, is representing the voices of those whose voices are not seen in academic spaces or in other kinds of things. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more from you about what you saw as the role of anthropology. And I thought that actually resonated nicely with Essen, your discussion about kind of the global north in the south and the south in the north, and the ways that academic spaces are often predicated on forms of exclusion and capitalism and thinking that are not amenable to other forms of thinking. And so I thought maybe the two of you could sort of discuss that a little bit. Thanks.
I hope the speakers are taking notes, because I'm going to follow Iftikhar's lead and cluster the questions of everyone who has their hands up. So if we could just go from front to back and take all the hands that are up right now and invite you to answer them together and separately.
I have a couple of questions for Nanika, and one I think is fairly straightforward, but it's about the title of the paper and the Indian Himalaya. And I think you began by describing your own research on in a district village on the border with Tibet, and I was just curious about what Indian designated. Is it the function or role of the state? Is it a geographic claim? Is it a claim about a kind of set of shared disaster zones that you're seeing? Because it does seem to me like that even the India-China border at Arunachal or the India-Pakistan, I mean, these are very different kinds of borders. The second question I had is a little bit, I guess, more amorphous, but it's about recursion and the role of recursion in the narratives that you're hearing. It's been at least 25 years since I read Sate's Beastly Tales. But from what I recall, isn't there like some debt to the Panchatantra, or like, that there are other stories that he's retelling? He's not claiming to be, crafting these stories anew. And so in some ways, when you were describing the stories that are being told now about these cats, in what ways are they mobilizing other stories, older stories, ways of recounting place and belonging to the Himalayas? I was struck in particular by the image you showed, which I'm guessing is not yours, of the leopard in between the parrot and the image of the parrot and the peacock, and then there's kind of a braid of flowers on the left. And I was thinking, like, wow, what is the story that this photographer is telling? Not just the stories that you're hearing, but what's this photograph saying to us? There is an astonishing likeness for me, as someone who's worked very closely on M.F. Hussein's Through the Eyes of a Painter, with a film still that I've published on his 1967 film Through the Eyes of a Painter, in which he's in a village in Rajasthan, and there are wall paintings of two tigers on the walls and a goat in between. And it's supposed to be funny, right? That there's a live goat in between two painted tigers and a village wall. And I was like, I wonder if this photographer, it was a films division of India Film. I was like, I wonder if this photographer knows Hussein's work, which is set in Rajasthan. And even if there's a kind of a retelling of modern narratives, not quite as old as the Panchatantra, right? But modern narratives in describing what's happening.
Thank you all for your wonderful papers. I'll start with Essen, and then I have a few questions for Nanika. So I was really struck by the southern episteme and the theorization that's coming from the Indus. I was hoping to hear a little bit more about where the epistemic heft is, what constitutes that episteme, right? So for example, I mean, I'm just looking at, I work on the tributary of the Indus in Kashmir, in Indian-occupied Kashmir, and the ways people engage with infrastructure on that tributary is by not necessarily resisting it, but by claiming that, in Islam, we are okay. We've been instructed to use the water optimally, right? So that infrastructure, to an extent, allows us to use that water effectively and efficiently. And that's fine with us, right? That part is fine with us. So the resistance comes from somewhere else. And I'm wondering, in your case, where does that heft come from then, right? Is it the entanglements, everyday entanglements between people and their soil, between people and their water? Is that where it comes from? Or is it some other kind of a vision, right, for the present or the future or the past that they draw that episteme from? So that was my question for you, Ehsan. Nenika, my own take on the Anthropocene with Andrew Bauer, who's an archaeologist. I mean, one reason I collaborated with him on this book on the Anthropocene was because I felt archaeologists did time better than ethnographers, right? And I think I want to revisit this notion of time and temporality in the Anthropocene debate, because one of our key interventions in that book was to rethink the Anthropocene, or not rethink it, but basically jettison the term entirely because of what it does to the notion of time and human. And how it does that is by creating a binary between humans as biological agents and as geological agents. And humans have always been biological and geological agents. So the idea was, how does the Anthropocene then recover or resuscitate this idea of nature, which is essentially what we need to get rid of. Nature with a capital N, of course. So that was my thing. So my question then is, why do we feel the need to bring the Anthropocene back, right? Give it a new life, a new lease of life at this moment. Yeah, so I'll stop there. I have other stuff, but I know.
Can we answer these? Because there are lots, and then we could take some more. I won't be able to remember. Yeah.
Okay. Mr. is the boss.
Yeah, I can go. So.
Are we questioning, or you want to reply any question?
Let's have a round of replies and then we go have a round of questions.
Great.
You can speak in the mic.
Yeah. So I guess there are 3 points that I'm gonna speak about, particularly starting with the amenability of academic spaces to other forms of theorizing, learning. So obviously there's a vibrant debate in the academia for a while on this issue, and I mean it's a very long debate, but the moment of convergence that I was pointing out, like the late 90s and the early 2000s, it's really we theorize it as like one of the waves of the epistemic decolonization. So there's been a lot written about it, about how to engage with academics and in activist spaces, but I want to sort of approach it from the experience of these community members and activists of receiving academics in their spaces and then receiving what I would call the cultural products, the knowledge forms that we create, papers, books, or citational authority of some sort. So what is that experience? And it's not just the academic, but like so we can invite an activist in this gathering. This is a gathering we're talking about these issues. We can also take the focus on the Lok Sat that I mentioned, the people's gathering. It's obviously grounded in notions of traditional sort of practices of sitting together in decision making, but obviously repurposed for the context in which you're facing, let's say, the bigger forces, even forces at the level of the canal, at the level of the river, at the level of beyond the nation-state frameworks, at the level of the planetary climate change. So it's repurposed, and then it's kind of like drawing from a lot of academic ideas as well around, or at least ideas that are received in these spaces both from original engagement with the political conflicts and from academic spaces as well. But there is the sort of concerns of all sorts of people, the experts that come and tell you that, okay, we're going to build this canal infrastructure and that's going to be good for you. The consultants who are often hired for the conflict resolution. So one of the consultants that was hired for this CRBC canal was an academic based, South Asian academic based in the US, and they would be participating in consultancies with Exxon and all sorts of oil and extractive companies all over the world and World Bank in a conflict resolution framework. So a lot of community members will pick up on the infrastructure and benefit from it. Of course, there are beneficiaries on the ground and they would adjust to it, or but then the others, the leftover, the effectees, the residual, they are dealt with these kind of like consultants. So that's knowledge, but also researchers coming and sort of with good intentions perhaps, but you either being slightly extractive or misrepresenting the movements because their vocational concern, their interlocutors and the peers are elsewhere, and the theoretical frames and the debates that they're focused on are not only in different from the debates that these activists would or community members would be having in the Sat, in the Daira form, but sometimes kind of like conflicting with those interpretations. And so from that sort of the side of the experience, this is kind of like a challenge of the spiral and the daira, and our image of the movements is also like these kind of movements is like pluriversal, open, non-violent in some ways, and very invitational. And but who gets included in the daira, and what kind of decision making happen in those spaces to receive academics as well? So that's kind of like, I think, also something that needs to be investigated or included, why it is so difficult for theories to emerge from these certain locations in these particular ways. And the epistemic heft is on the Indus, at least in these movements that I'm talking about, there are a variety of actors, there are a variety of claims. So the question that I ask in my thesis and now like the book that I'm working on is like, why do ideas of river defense take hold in some of these places along the river and not others? So, you know, there are all sorts of projects, there are dams, canals, drainage issues, embankments. A lot of people here share those concerns. So why do sometimes somewhere movements get up and say, we're going to defend the river? In a variety of idioms, it's not just kind of like an environmentalist claim, a modern secular scientific environmentalism. It's neither just the sacred or the indigenous in that particular way. I mean, the difficulty of the term indigeneity in South Asian context, I'm sure people are familiar with that sort of debate that also probably needs to happen in all sorts of locations. So you know, but it's some kind of also not removed from these influences. Sat is not just a traditional old romanticized space. It's dealing with the canal, the ADB, the World Bank, the new nation state forums, and imagining alternative forums which are not only places for building strategy, but if you recall the code, it's kind of like the conceptualized as a meditative space, like meditating on the truth. You're confronted with this beast or this big hydra, as the Zapatistas say, this monster. How can you strategize step 1, step 2, step 3 to defeat? It's just not possible. So it's deliberative, it's meditative, and then it's also reflecting on the condition of, I think, destruction and ruination, which we can conceptualize from here as well. But the places that are disappearing, what is that space for us? Like we're just like, how much are we extracting from them? What's our relationship to these kind of spaces? So as the epistemic heft it's kind of like emergent from these spaces, these forms, the Daira and the Sat and the Karakolis, and it's emergent in the conversation with, I think, in conversation with the activists and communities that are engaged in these things. And by the time some of this comes to the academy, it's translated and filtered through so much. So the earlier sort of question, and I think that's also the idea of envisioning the medium of language. I would imagine take that medium of language as an institutional form, like, you know, the Spivak challenge of can the subaltern Steve repurpose as like the lack of institutional agency for, so what is the medium, how do you articulate these things? And of course these are being said, these are being articulated, these are being imagined and discussed in these spaces with difficulty and with limitations. No need to romanticize these spaces as well, but yeah, this ends. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to take Sonal's question first and then come to the first and the third, because I think there were some similarities between them. So Sonal, the first point about why Indian, because I actually, in the longer version, I talk a lot about the Indian state and the very particular relationship between the Indian state and the mountain people. So that's how India becomes quite central to this. But of course, you're absolutely right to point out that there are much longer relationships across the Himalaya, and there are also some series of events and climatic and environmental and political resonances across the Himalayan region that I need to do more with and think more. And actually, the last 2 days has really helped me think about that. The second question on recursion, yes, absolutely. There is a way in which in these stories there is the Panchatantra comes in. What is really very prevalent in Uttarakhand are actually colonial shikar accounts, particularly the figure of Jim Corbett, who I write about extensively in my book, who is constantly brought up again and again. And those storytelling, even Sher Khan, Kipling, Jungle Book, it's amazing to see how the certain kinds of stories that sort of recur in this area. But there are also other kinds of stories which we perhaps don't know that much about, which is what I try to do in my book. I try to center those a bit more, though I have a very strong critique of Corbett and the way Corbett is circulating in Uttarakhand even today, especially within state spaces, not just as a storyteller. On the image that you talked about, it's the cover of my book, and actually it's by a Bombay photographer called Nayan Khanolkar, who very kindly gave it to me. It's amazing that the image is by a camera trap. It was a camera trap image. So it wasn't at all, doctored or structured or whatever. It was just taken. It's in RA Colony in Bombay, in Mumbai. And he very kindly gave it to me. And the reason I use that image, even though most of my work is in the Himalaya, not in Bombay, is because I have a chapter on visuals and what are the different ways in which today we are seeing big cats. So one of the ways in which we're seeing them is through WhatsApp forwards and visuals on that. But another way in which conservationists and state agents are really trying to understand the inner lives of big cats is through camera trap imagery and the sort of whole move towards digital conservation, which I sort of also write about. And so that's why I use that image. I actually wanted another image, which was also camera trap image from Bombay, but it was the copyright of National Geographic and they refused to give it to me and my press couldn't find it. So yeah, but that image is striking because, and the way I think Nayan, his title for that image is just Alley Cat. And it won some awards in, this film, photographer of the year, wildlife photographer of the year in the UK, etc. So, but it's fascinating that it isn't a staged photograph. Like a lot of the other kinds of photographs that we think of big cats are, like the shikar photographs or, the professional wildlife photographers who go and sit for days and months before they get that perfect image of the tiger or the leopard. But yeah, so I think Mona and your question, they're different but they're similar, because what both of you are asking me to argue here is that what is the Anthropocene? Why is the Anthropocene at all useful, right? Because in a way, what you're saying is that what I have described in this talk is very much old anthropology, almost like Malinowskian anthropology, right? Of going and telling stories of a particular form. And I think, Mona, your book and your critique of the Anthropocene is very well taken and a very important critique. So, why resuscitate, why revive this, right? And as I said, I myself had a very strong critique of the concept in 2015 and I was not interested in it. So let me very quickly try to explain why I think that, what I'm doing is not just traditional anthropology or traditional ethnographic work. Of course, I've very much drawn on that, and I'm very, I am an old-fashioned British social anthropologist in that way with my training in India and the UK. But I think that there's something else which is happening, which I didn't get time to talk about in this talk, but it's in my book and it's in my future work. Now, I should just explain, a lot of this work actually comes from fieldwork I've done with wildlife biologists and with climate scientists in the UK and in India. It is also work I've done with geologists and with geographers, physical geographers. And that is what led me to sort of re-see some of these stories. It also comes from, frankly, a very strong critique I have of multi-species ethnography and of the ways in which the anthropology of South Asia was limiting certain accounts to the region or to very localized narratives which have no relationship to the wider world or to the planet. And I'm trying in the book, and actually in my new project and a collaborative project that I have on the climate crisis, to think about how anthropology as a discipline with, with its old-fashioned baggage, etc., can speak to the planetary crisis. Now, why do I think the Anthropocene is useful in this? I think it's useful for 3 reasons at least. One is that we don't see these stories as just localized stories of, what's happening in the Himalayas, this like exotic place, and these people talk about tigers and leopards in this way, which is unfortunately how my work is often like initially received as, oh, how quaint, let me see, especially because the big cats, he's a charismatic megafauna. There is a particular way in which they're received. There are also very long-standing narratives on man-eaters, which someone like Corbett sort of exemplifies, right? That shikar, the terrifying beast, etc., the conquest of nature, which are very hard to dislodge. And I found that one of the ways to dislodge it is by actually moving away both from these colonial accounts, but also from the new conservationist accounts, because they're the ones which are sort of very, very powerful when it comes to studying big cats. And the question is, how do you move away from that? So I think in the longer, again, and that this is all in the book, so I realize I haven't presented it here, which is, perhaps not the smartest thing to do while making a case for the Anthropocene. I'm sort of interested in trying to break particular narrative accounts of how we understand big cats in India without losing the specificity of what we are hearing from the Himalaya, but making it speak to wider questions of what is the climate crisis, what has caused it, what is the Anthropocene, why is it interesting, why is it important, how do we speak to it? The question of time and temporality is super important, Mona. And one of the reasons I actually got drawn to this concept again was not just because I think there's a scale shifting that the Anthropocene allows us to do, where this is not just a story about Chamoli in India, this is not just about South Asia, but actually this is speaking to wider questions of inequality and structures and history and empire and capital. But one of the reasons I really got interested in it was actually the ways in which, if we take these beastly tales seriously, the ways in which they invoke time. So the ways in which they talk about the Angrez and the time of the Angrez, the way they talk about even before that, the way they talk about the post-colonial state, or they talk about the future, this movement in time is something that I sort of find fascinating. I also think that the more recent work on the Anthropocene, which is coming from indigenous scholars, say, in North America, or which has come from other kinds of sources, has done a very good job of breaking the geological hold that the concept had. Because I completely agree that it was a category that came out of geology and it had this geological overtone, but I think there is a way in which we can remake it, right? I'm also thinking of some of the more recent anthropology work, whether it's Donna Haraway or Anna Singh, and the ways in which they have challenged it. I should also say that I'm not wedded to the concept, so if I felt like, so I wrote this book first without Anthropocene in it, but I actually felt like that the framing helps me do the scale shifting. It allows me to be able to speak to scientists and wildlife biologists. It allows me to also structure, like talk about movement in time, and allows me to structure wider things like politics, economics, capital, empire, through these very, very localized stories. And so I think that's why I found it useful. But yeah, sorry, I will shut up. I could go on forever.
I see a question from Lalita Gopalan, and back there,
And Kajri.
sure.
I think we should prioritize those. Very quickly. Yes, hi, thank you. You can hear me, right?
I have the microphone here. I'm so sorry. I just turned it off. Just let us know and we'll take it. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I will try, this is more in the realm of suggestions, and through Vastavika's presentation, Anindita's query, which I want to sort of place here. So it's like the early morning session, so it's between dream and being awake. So I will say this. It's what Anindita had, and I was also thinking, it's precisely the kinds of material that was used to share your written presentation and what was being projected on screen, right? So you have both versions. Vastavika definitely referred to the form as being integral to her presentation, and both Ehsan and Nayanika used it as a form of illustration. So I have two questions, suggestions, not queries actually. So for Ehsan, much of what you showed, I know you're working with activism, but I'm sort of like, we're in a museum. And I was sort of dreaming of my colleague Cherie Smith, who works on a critique and a revision of land art. So what you showed turned out to be, for me, accidental works of land art. Okay, the silting, the ruination. I thought, oh, this looks like, then I thought, oh no, I have to be really sort of thinking of dams and see. But, but I think there's some work to be done from that kind of an engagement, and these are sort of works that I've been sort of curious to hear. Nanika's response to Sonal, I have to say, somebody who works on digital. I don't think these are camera grabs. I think these are totally digital fakes. Both photographs are totally digital
So
fakes.
the second one was, but the first one is...
No,
Oh, really?
it's a total fake. Sorry. Somebody, they're like, wow, what is it? It's like, I can tell. Of course, they're going to tell you that it is real, etc. Right? I mean, whatever. But for me, it's like, no, that looks like a digital fake. I mean, I can see the cutout lines, even the foliage, and I can see it.
No, there was a bigger photograph that he cut out. Anyway.
No, so feeding into your idea of temporality, there is the entire question of temporality, and there's the question of sort of digital time and what that means to have so many different spaces put together, etc. And I looked at it, I thought like, oh, this is grand. She's going to get to this, because that's my area of work. I was thinking, oh, very interesting. I thought, how does it all add up? I mean, so it's lovely. The plastic wrappers of potato chips. So I thought, okay.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we are technically out of time, so we're going to go. Here's some more questions quickly. 15 minutes more, says Iftikhar. So, Kajri, you had a question for Vastavika. Can we have that?
Actually, it was including her. So, I mean,
Okay.
I guess I was... thank you. I mean, these were such thought-provoking, wonderful papers. Thinking with Ehsan, and also my wonderful colleague Shozab Raza, who's written a book called, or is writing a book called Theory from the Trenches, where he is thinking about Marxism in Pakistan with Sufism. Okay, so these are theorists who are marrying the two, and realizing that part of the work of translating knowledge into an acceptable form is secularizing it, right? And that's kind of what the anthropologist does and has always done, taking up what you said, Reina. And so I'm just wondering then, when we're doing this kind of interdisciplinary work, are there some kind of master disciplines, of which anthropology may be one, but also the architects are doing this wonderful kind of very composite work, very synthetic work, at the level of the everyday, with a kind of different sensible attunement. So I'm just putting that question to the panel. What do you think? Are there master disciplines here that will help us think the Anthropocene?
Could I bundle the questions again? You've had your hand up for a really long time, gentlemen in the back.
Thank you for your presentations, Ehsan Bhai. I have talked to you about this for long, but there's one thing I'd say, and I had a question that I want to raise is, one thing is that what you said about consultancies and what they do, just what Professor Mathu just mentioned about National Geography, even though National Geography does all like saving and like conservation work, it is also an organization which goes and films about engineering technologies all over Himalayas. And they also frame about how infrastructures and engineers are doing this marvels by tunneling and doing like sponsored content. And actually about dams and tunnels and so many other things that they do. So like there's this conflict that is always there. And that's why people are critical of something like the BBC Earth. Now, coming on to the question is that what Ehsan Bhai pointed out about Darya and then whole southern theorizing, and you said that how it is received, and this is also something when I was listening to Vastavika's presentation, is that like you both tell like stories from two different standpoints, I believe. Like you was trying to say, give us a macro picture, whereas Vastavika is trying to give us like more stories from how people are receiving it. So I was wondering how then something like a climatic event is responded to. Like, let's say, Pakistan flood, let's say, which received so much of attention all over the world, how that was received by people, like the people you work with. Like, you showed a picture of that broken canal. Like, what was the story there? Like, how people, activists and other people who are working, how they have received it. And let's say in Vastavika's case, how the Mumbai floods, how that has been received. Like, that has got a lot of attention about Mumbai's waterways and what the infrastructure is. So like, how such climatic events are received by the people that you work with. Thank you.
Could we also? One more? Yeah, one more.
So I had him first, and then I'll go to Camelia. Two more.
Hello, can you all hear me? Yeah, thank you. That was a wonderful panel. I'll just have a question for the whole panel, building on the provocation that Nayanika made of interdisciplinarity, and I'll kind of add on to what Kajri said. I mean, I'm just taking a cue in the sense that Nayanika, if there is the question of interdisciplinarity at stake, or disciplinarity, or even transdisciplinarity at stake, I mean, I was just wondering, in your work, how does that question come in the sense that if I was trying, as an architect and a plan, I was trying to read space into what was happening, and I was connecting it to my work in Sanjay Gandhi National Park, in which Vastavikta has also been involved. And one of the stories that emerges of encounters with the wildcat is of Patai, the biggest of wildcats, who takes care of the other wildcats who are released by the forest officers and others in this. So what happens in those is that there is a question of spatiality that emerges. And so there are so many spatial subtle boundaries. So if one has to build on, say, the idea of subtle boundaries. So Descola points to that, but there is no building of spatiality beyond it. And so can you speak about it? I mean, this is just a cue, but you can speak about it in any other ways. Or Vastavikta, in your case, the drawings, although you speak about the cartographic boundaries kind of, need to be done away with. There are many ways in which boundaries emerge in your drawings, and in some of the ways in which the text kind of gets written also constructs boundaries. So can you speak about how the text constructs the boundaries, and I mean, in that sense, speak from the other discipline? Ehsan, I mean, I was kind of drawn to as you were speaking about the movement and the collective, I was drawn to the map. One of the ways in which Southern theorizing kind of opens up questions on social movements is that spatiality itself kind of produces fractures, and that it produces fractures because of the context of institutional, plural, and political legal frameworks that are embedded in them. So when you speak about the movement and the collective, is there one collective that is being spoken about, because that is such a large area, and do those boundaries on the maps of the canals, and there would be other boundaries, create many kinds of collectives? So just think with the other disciplines.
We have two last questions that we are going to take and add to this group.
Thank you, and I'll be quick. Thank you all three for fantastic papers, and I hope to be short and coherent. So Vastavik, I really loved the complexity that you showed, and I was just intrigued by to what extent you as an architect are engaging with anthropology. It seemed like a lot of discussions of the more than human that you beautifully brought in. So just your thoughts about like more than human ethnographies or multi-species ethnographies and architecture. And then for Ahsan, I really would love to maybe during the break hear more about ADB and World Bank in Pakistan. But I wanted to understand more about ruination and how you're conceptualizing it, and whether or not that is from the global north or south, and how would your colleagues conceptualize it? Is ruination a term that you've translated from a local language, or is it from stolers and so on? So I was just interested by that. And I would love to hear Nayanika speak about birds falling from the skies, and he waves and bears, but I'm guessing we are running out of time. But with the Anthropocene and Mona's intervention also, I was wondering if the term itself is more like environmental determinist, that, you know, we've already messed up the planet, whilst planetary crisis perhaps lets us deal with the historical environmental problems that we've caused and are exacerbated with what we do today. And if maybe there's an alternative framing that might be more politically engaging. Thank you.
The main one, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks all three of you for a wonderful panel. You know, when we were conceiving of this conference, you know, there were two things we wanted to do, which is one is that we wanted it to be interdisciplinary, you know, so that we would have a conversation precisely of the sort that we are having now. And the other is that we wanted it also to be cross-border. So we wanted to really think about South Asia in a way that could not be thought about within South Asia itself, because you cannot get visas, okay, and so on. And but one of the things I think I'm also struck by, obviously, the imbalance in, you know, the coverage of regions. For example, we wanted to have somebody who works on Afghanistan, but we couldn't find somebody, right? So there's really a great deal of imbalance. So keeping that in mind, you know, I'm going to primarily address SN because, you know, of course, this is. You know, I'm always looking for work on Pakistan, okay? And, you know, in last year when there was the floods, there was the Pakistan Student Association, they wanted to do fundraising, right? And I was advising them. And we actually had real trouble finding even images or good, you know, or analyses, okay? We just had reports from The Guardian and things like that, right? So this is a way for me to say that although, and of course, you know, we see the presentations by Vastavika, which is, you know, this very, let's say, a very like visually driven, data-driven kind of analysis of you know, the Sanjay Gandhi, you know, issues that implicate kind of biology and water and also human, you know, kind of and social lives. And so I know that, you know, I know that you are working through this material, and I know that you are reluctant to kind of, in a sense, present the view of the activist because you know, because of your concern with having it being kind of co-opted by academics. But I think it doesn't have to be. What I'm saying is that I guess I'm urging you to actually do some of that because, you know, at its best, academia can be an ally to the social movements rather than being seen against each other, right? And there is a real need to, I think, for people, for even these movements might benefit actually from making their concepts, their kind of, you know, views, okay, more. I mean, one of the ways that Zapatista, in fact, succeed is because they were very successful in kind of, you know, everyone knows about the Zapatista, right? So I think, you know, in a sense that if we think about Southern theorizing and, you know, theorizing from location, then I think that it is important for these activist movements, you know, their spokesmen or whatever, or communities to kind of, in a sense, put forward the theorizations, the visuals, the anthropological accounts, or whatever disciplinary or cross-disciplinary ways that they may find to articulate their claims while still respecting notions of, you know, collectivity and placemaking and so on. So, yeah. So I guess I was the last. Then it's time for answers.
Right, time for answers. Shall we start with Vastavika and come down to the room?
Yeah. So Vastavika, my question was for the whole panel, and it drew on Nayanika's provocation on interdisciplinarity. And I was asked, the question that I asked was for Nayanika and Ehsan to speak about spatiality in their work, and in your work to think with the text, and how does it kind of lend itself to spatiality and the boundaries, because you were talking about doing away with cartographic boundaries. Yeah. Can you can you all speak to each other in that sense?
Vastavika, sorry about not hearing the question. My question was about the thing that something like when you're talking about micro narratives, how did something like a climatic event was like the Mumbai floods or the floods that happened, how that was responded to, or what is the response of the people who work with to floods like that? Thank you.
Hi, Vastavika. Thank you for a great paper. I was just wondering how you engage with more than human ethnographies and anthropological or environmental anthropology in your work, and really liked your analysis of these different marine species. Thank you.
I think that's it. So if you could answer, thank you.
Um, so I'll take the second question first about the micro narratives. Essentially, when I went on site, and the way I essentially work is through drawing itself. And the moment I was on site, I was looking for. I started going to these homes and started talking to them, and the idea of the changing climate actually did not emerge. Like people were talking about, like for example, in the second case, they were talking about termite infestations. They were talking about snakes coming into their house. They were talking about silt and sludge and everything entering the house. So the vocabulary of climate change essentially wasn't there, but there was a sense of like things kind of changing. And then I think the challenge that I had was that how do you start like experientially like start drawing these micro narratives out, and then how can how can like the reader themselves start piecing these micro narratives to like get a larger sense of the way things are changing on site. I think the second, or I mean, the first and the third question, like the site that the different sites that I was working with, especially the first one in RA, it like the moment I went inside, I spent a lot of time in this person's garden, and the only thing that she was essentially telling me, she was my field interlocutor, and the only thing she was telling me was about how this like she was telling me stories about the species, about what happened, about what did she see, how did she see things kind of changing. She spoke about say her mother-in-law, like the practices that she has, the relationships that she has with the grass, the paddy and everything. And it was interesting because the way she was talking about it, she was talking about it from through the lens of cosmology, through the lens of spirits, gods. But on the other hand, like I was also going through a lot of like reports on these kind of species that were there, and the biggest challenge was that how does one straddle these two different kinds of ways of drawing, thinking, and even like representing different kinds of spaces. So on the one hand, where I had like poetry and stories that were coming in, and on the other hand there were these reports that were literally like quantifying things in very like different ways. And then and I feel like both of them do have some sort of merit. And then the challenge was that like how to like sit on site and then how to start essentially drawing these things out. Let's look at both of these things, because both of these things are essentially actively kind of shaping space, but also like I feel like I am like I was still burdened with the idea of like cartography because I'm trained as an architect. So the only way I knew how to like start was through the idea of like the plan and section. And then how does one kind of move away from that lens to like start thinking about say atmospheres, climate, the visceral experience on site itself. So I think that is something I still kind of struggle with. But yeah, I think and like and even the problem of drawing in a particular way from and drawing out in a particular way from different kinds of sites, because the intertidal demanded a different kind of understanding. It demanded a different kind of walking into the sea, or on the sand itself, versus walking across pastures, or walking across the channelized river banks. So all of these three different sites made me understand that there's no one way that these things could be seen or drawn or represented. And maybe storytelling kind of becomes interesting. It becomes like a good tool to start drawing these things out. Yeah.
I love that you took us to this point, because we've been speaking of theory and language, and you were talking about method and practice. So I think we really needed this very concrete dimension of embodied, emplaced, and experiential. I think I said affective, but it matters, right? The affective ecology, I think I heard it in the two other panelists' work deeply. And so maybe that's a good note for us to kind of think think further about quantification and together, because that's also a science-arts convergence that I feel we don't, humanists and social scientists, even quantitative social scientists, don't think often enough when we are speaking of these hyperobjects. Thank you. Thank you all.